Now let's start with the starting page. Here on this starting page, we want the featured events. So we need to load those featured events onto this index.js page. So into this index.js component here, this homepage component. The question now is, how do we want to load the data? Now we could do it with client-side data fetching. We could use useEffect with the fetch API or install and use the useSWR hook here, which we learned about. We could do that, but does this make sense? Is this the best solution here? I would argue that here we actually want to use one of the two forms of pre-rendering instead. So static generation or server-side rendering. Because the starting page, which we're looking at here, this is a page which should be understood by search engine crawlers. It's important that they are able to understand our site and, well, direct traffic to our site. And as a visitor on this page, it would also be nice if we see something instantly. It's also not likely that this data changes multiple times per second or minute even, so there isn't really a reason for loading this on the client side. It's also not some user-specific data, and it's also not data behind a login screen or anything like that. So here I would argue it makes a lot of sense to pre-render this page with some data. That then just leaves one question. Should we use get server-side props for real server-side pre-rendering, where the page is pre-rendered on the server on the fly for every request? Or do we want get static props to pre-render the page during the build process and potentially also on the server if we set revalidate to a certain value so that we have a mostly updated page? I would argue for this kind of page, we don't need server-side rendering. We don't need to pre-render it for every request. Instead, using get static props makes most sense here, I would say. So we can export this async function getStaticProps here in this index.js file, get our context, though here we won't need it, so we can also omit it, and then in here return an object with the props for this homepage component. Now the props should be an object, and in there I want to have my featured events, which now should be fetched from Firebase, not from the dummy data.js file anymore. We're past this world. Now we have the Firebase backend and we want to fetch the data from there. Now, how do we fetch the featured events from Firebase? Actually, when it comes to querying Firebase, you can adjust the HTTP request which is being sent with some query parameters to filter the data you are retrieving. If you search for Firebase real-time database filter, you'll find this retrieving data article. And there you learn how you can adjust the URL to which you send the request with query parameters to, well, filter the data which you're retrieving. And you can filter by specific child keys, look for certain values, and so on. Now you can do that, and feel free to dive into the docs to implement it such that you do filter on Firebase side for retrieving only selected data. I will not do that here because this is not a Firebase course and it's really just a dummy backend. Instead, I will add a new file here, let's say in a helpers folder, a file which I'll name API util.js. So which has utility functions for working with an API. And in there, I will now add a function which gives me the featured events, but I will actually always fetch all events first and then filter them just here in JavaScript. Which is of course not ideal, because it means that we always fetch all the data even if we don't need it. But as I just said, that's just not the focus here. It would be very Firebase specific if we write the Firebase query logic here, and that, well, basically leads nowhere. So therefore, I'll go to dummy.data.js and copy the getFeaturedEvents function from there, and add it here in the API util.js file. But I'll also add another function here, get all events, and in there I will write the logic for fetching all events data from Firebase. So I'll turn this into an async function so that I can use async await here. I'll also convert get featured events into an async function. And then here in get all events, I will call fetch, so the built-in fetch API, which is available in the browser and thanks to Next.js also can be used inside of get static props and get server-side props. And here we'll then send a request to this Firebase URL, so to this REST API URL, which then triggers Firebase to talk to our database here. There we want to reach out into the events node, so this node which I added here. And then because it's Firebase, we need to add .json at the end here. That's Firebase specific. Now since we use async here, we can also await this to get our response like this without then. Under the hood, async await still uses then, but we can write it in this more convenient way here. And we can get our data by awaiting response.json. We also might want to implement error handling here, but for the moment I'll skip it. Instead here we then have the data, and as you learned in the last section, Firebase returns your data as an object. So I will transform my events here. I'll add them as an empty array and then loop through my data, so through all the keys in data, so through all the entries in events. So these are my keys, E1, E2, and E3. And I'll loop through them, and for every key I'll push a new event into this events array, where the ID is equal to key, and where I then want to distribute all the nested data, which is stored under that key, into that events object. And to not manually write all these key value pairs, I'll use the spread operator and just copy everything from data for the given key, so from this nested object here into this object which we push onto events. That should ensure that events is an array full of objects with all these fields here and with an ID field which is E1, E2, or E3. And then I will return events here. Now overall we still return a promise here because of async, but that promise will then resolve to this events array. And in get featured events, we can now get all events by awaiting the result of calling get all events. So this function I just worked on, I call it here. Since it returns a promise, I await that promise, which I can because I added async here. Then I have all events and I return all events, filtering for the events that are featured. Again, that means that we always load all events first, but here for this demo, that is okay. Now it's get featured events, this get featured events, not the one from dummy data, which I want to use in index.js. So here we want to import get featured events from, and then I'll dive into the helpers folder into API util. And now here in get static props, we can get the featured events by awaiting the result of get featured events. So of calling this function which we just worked on, which I now imported. We can use await because that is an async function, and then it's these featured events which I'll set as a value for the featured events prop. Now we can also name this prop just events. It doesn't have to be named featured events. And with that in get static props, we return an object with our featured events in props, and the featured events ultimately are fetched from Firebase. So now in the component function here, which is executed after get static props, we now should accept props, so the props which are set by get static props. And then here we no longer need to call getFeaturedEvents, and we don't want to call it here because we don't want to fetch them on the client. Instead, I just forward props.events, so my events here, to event list. And now let's see if that works. If we save that, if we go back to the starting page and reload, that's looking good. I see my events and I can still click on them. And if I reload and view the page source here, we see that the event data is actually part of that HTML file which was sent back by the server. So pre-rendering this page with the event data worked. And here we are using static generation because we're using getStaticProps. So this applies what we learned with Firebase and with getStaticProps to this home page.